So I got asked an interesting question last night. Why are you interested in this platform stuff anyway, and where did that all come from? And I had an answer that said, well, it's because all my favorite television shows kept getting canceled. Now, how does that lead to this? Well, it's because I like things like Twin Peaks, which is very narrow. And it turns out that ad-sponsored business models simply do not support these narrow types of interests. Now, a lot of things have changed, as anybody who watches some of the Netflix, say, Lilyhammer now might attest, but that was really the beginning of trying to dig in carefully to what is going on in some of these industries and how does the pricing work and what are the business models. And that was in about 1997 when we were doctoral students here and had a lot less gray hair. Okay, so first of all, I'd also like to just echo what Dave said in terms of just thanking this community. I mean, through the MIT Center for Digital Business, I've had the honor of working with Cisco, with SAP, with IPC, Thomson Reuters, Mass Mutual, United States Postal Service, International Post Corp, and we've also done some work previously with Microsoft. So, and have had interactions with many, many more. And I think it's important as academics that we essentially try to put our ideas in front of an audience of people who actually have to face these issues every day and road test them. And so days like today are absolutely critical for academics like Marshall and me. And as Marshall mentioned, we're writing a book, and the goal of that is to try to kind of wrap up, if you will, about 10 years or so of thinking into, well, why are these things happening now? What are some of the design rules if you wanted to build these? How do you think about perhaps reorganizing to face some of these competitors? And then, you know, once these are going, what might you expect going forward? So that's what we're going to be working on. And again, a day like today and the next 6 months of interacting with people in the room and all of the firms that you represent are going to be our way of making sure that we're addressing the issues that you care about and that we're able to feed back to you something of value. And when I get up in front and I do perhaps executive education, or if I'm trying to really work on a specific problem, I often will point out to people that I've had the luxury of thinking narrowly. So when I'm dealing with somebody that's running a division, they've got 100 things coming at them constantly, but it's opportunities like now that I get to think narrowly and then test that against and work with people. So terrific opportunities for Marshall. I'm really glad to be here. Okay, so I want to start with just this observation, and you can challenge me, and that's fine. But we think there's something going on in the economy that's really different than what we had seen before. And it's not different in a complete, this is here and that's there, and physics no longer work, and water now flows uphill. It's different in kind of subtle but important ways. So I'll take a familiar example. Everybody, I'm sure, had a cell phone 15 years ago. And it had some functionality. You pushed a button and a program operated, and then it made a phone call. That's an app. But we didn't think of it that way because all of the development happened on this border. And then eventually, it got to me as a customer, but I really had no idea what was going on back here. Much as few of you would know on your anti-lock brake system, a critically important piece of embedded software, you have no idea where that comes from. You just know that it works. And that's still, a lot of software operates that way. But much else in this sort of reconfiguring has now become much more visible and exposed to a set of users. And we're now starting to see this kind of triangular relationship where we'll transact with one another across some common platform. And that's the change that's captured our imagination. And we're really trying to tease out, well, what are the moving parts? And how do we do that carefully? Okay, so more broadly, and I'm sure we could iterate on this for the rest of the day, so I'm not going to take this as gospel. But more broadly, when we think of platforms, we think of a set of technology and business building blocks, and the business part's important. So if you think about a default contract, a set of financial arrangements that everybody can have access to, those are building blocks that mean that you don't have to do bilateral contracting. So it makes it easier to go to market. The technology, of course, a set of well-defined APIs, a technology stack that is stable and you can depend upon, that allow you to use resources in common. And then for us, so I went through the International Motor Vehicle Program as a PhD student. And we talked a lot about platforms, but there we were interested in, if I build a car, I can get a 2-door and a 4-door and a sport ute for the same engineering dollars. So that would be a platform that doesn't really have strong network effects. We're interested in platforms that have network effects such that more people on one side of a market makes the system more valuable to other people on the other side of a market. And we can dive down and they can go in different ways, but broadly, that's what we mean is systems that grow in value with usage. And actually, that idea will turn out to be really important to some common business models. And then finally, we'll think about systems that, because of the data that they're collecting on an ongoing basis, are able to make better matches. But it's not just a one-time match that's critical. The idea is that having made a match, then there's a flow. And the flow comes from repeated interaction, and that's a joint value creation. And that's a very different kind of situation than this sort of more linear model. And that's a big change. And so that's one of the things I wanted to just put out as a set of common language for us today. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the disruptions that this might cause to traditional industries. People are familiar with the Boston Globe, but you may not be with the Times-Picayune, which is my hometown newspaper in New Orleans. It's a great newspaper, at least it used to be. It had incredible writing. It did great coverage of the political scene, and I was pleased to have it dropped on my doorstep in the Dead Tree edition every single day. Well, it now publishes 3 days a week. The business model just wasn't working anymore because they got disrupted. And the disruption happened from the usual suspects. You've got a set of news aggregators, and you've got a set of entities that came in and peeled off the most important piece of the business model, which was the classified ad revenue. And then the problems that needed to be solved, well, these ones were solved a long time ago. And then on the news aggregation, you had a set of social curation problems where you were able to sort of gather things in from disparate sources and then use a set of kind of a community to then rack and stack and tailor things to your own interests. That's very disruptive, and you can see that in the bottom lines. And I went and checked the New York Times market cap, which peaked somewhere back in the day around in the tens of billions of dollars, and it's down under 2. So probably 80% or more down, largely as a result of this type of force. Currently, we're seeing a lot of disruption in the lodging industry. So Boston Globe's been doing some kind of interesting things talking about Airbnb. And they revealed to us that right now there are 150,000 rooms that are kind of available on this weird sort of peer-to-peer housing situation, and Hilton's at 600,000. But later on this summer, they're going to be up to 200,000. And I don't think Hilton's going to be at 800,000. So there's a different growth rate. And it's very disruptive. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of new supply that has come to market. And if you think about that supply, it has some interesting characteristics. So how much does it cost the average homeowner or apartment owner to make their apartment available when they're not using it? Yeah, pretty close to zero. So what we have is a lot of supply that's already paid for. So all the CapEx is dealt with, all the fixed costs are covered, and it was essentially underutilized. And it was always there. But now what's happened is that supply has been exposed and then made available, and then there's a matching system that allows you to now search for it. That's very disruptive when you are actually having to get things like loans and mortgages and perhaps float debt issues in order to build some of the types of capacity that these entities require. But it didn't happen by accident. There were a lot of problems that needed to be solved. And in particular, you had to solve a bilateral trust problem. So it's not that I can just go to Marshall if we didn't know one another and go, hey, you know, I want to rent your apartment. So the obvious question would be, who are you and who am I? And why in the world should we trust one another? And so that's the critical element where there's an immediate feedback loop that says, you know, the apartment was clean and I didn't trash it as a renter. And then the moment that that falls apart, I'll be blacklisted. And that has to be enforced. And of course, bad things happen. So they thought they could get away without the insurance, but bad things happen. And it's not that bad things don't happen on this side. It's just that that's not news. But when bad things happen over here, it is news. And so they had to then have a default insurance contract that's provided by the platform that's available to all users. And so that's an interesting thing that the platform does. And so with just a couple of examples, that begins to lay out kind of a set of, and it's only a beginning, but a set of kind of paths of disruption. And one of them is this notion of a gatekeeper that is standing and enforcing high margins. And that gatekeeper, so before it might have been, say, the news, and so they were providing news supply and then restricting access to that and enforcing high margins on the classified ad revenue side. And then when that gets disrupted, that business model is in real trouble. So that's sort of one path to disruption that we've observed. There are others. I just mentioned the whole issue of new supply. So if you think of your hotels as being the visible, and then there's this entire ocean. And so when you're in a business that relies heavily on CapEx, you might think, well, what are the substitutes that might end up getting exposed and brought onto market that I need to be aware of? And what are the systems that would make that possible? And what are the problems that need to be solved that are protecting me today, but might end up getting solved tomorrow, and then bring that on stream? And then finally, and I think this is a really important one, and I began at the beginning of the talk with this, is this notion of a joint production. So again, when you have this kind of linear value chain of value add from the upstream and then downstream, and then I sell you some finished product or service, there's not a lot of joint production going on there. I just hand it off and I say, do well with it, and we hope that that goes nicely. And so I'll give an example, actually, for the Thomson Reuters folks in the room. So we're a heavy user of Thomson Reuters financial data services at our trading room back at Tulane. And so we've built out essentially a floor that would look like Goldman Sachs. And you can do all kinds of weird and wonderful things in commodities markets. We train students to do this. Don't blame us for the meltdown. And that data feed, from Thomson Reuters' point of view, is essentially a mystery. It lands at our server room, and then we capture it onto this sort of 3 terabyte tick capture thing so that I can go back and do back testing of algorithms. And from their point of view, it's just gone. There's not a feedback loop that says, what did they do with that? And if we had been involved in that, would we have learned something? And could we then iterate and make that work better? So that's more of a pipe but a lot of systems now are co-creating value. That's really important. So I'll take an example that people were very familiar with, Facebook. So Facebook started as, hey, I'm going to find my long-lost roommate, girlfriend, neighbor, whatever. That's a matching function. So that's compelling for, I don't know, about 10 minutes. Okay, maybe a couple of hours. And then since I'm looking around the room, there are enough of us who are parents in the room, the other thing we do is kind of keep track of our children. So that's the other function. But it turns out now that the primary thing people might go back for is a news feed. Because that news feed is actually what changes constantly. Now let's think about what the news feed is. The news feed is essentially an aggregation of people's posts, people's uploads of videos and content, increasingly their location information, and then that's presented to me in this sort of new data service. So that's a collective sort of production system, and then the platform itself is starting to add a lot of value back, sort of taking a set of inputs in and then streaming it back in a customized way. That's pretty different. And that requires sort of thinking through how do you set up a system that when all the users are doing something, that starts to add value also, and you're capturing the information. So now let's talk a little bit for those in the room about education. So I notice that we've got Pearson here in force, and we thank you very much. So I work at Tulane University, the bottom one there, and we've got MIT in the middle and BU at the top. That somehow seems appropriate. Alphabetical. So if you're going to be honest about the business model, and you look at it, especially for BU and Tulane, so we have not huge endowments, maybe $1 billion. It sounds like a lot. It isn't. Because it only covers maybe 5% of the operating costs on an ongoing basis. So that means that you're revenue driven out of the tuition side. So where does the money come from and where does it go? Well, many of you who have taken freshman physics and freshman calculus in any kind of large course, that's where they make the money. And then any of you who have taken a course with about 8 people, or walked on a nice college campus where the lawns are mowed and the buildings function, that's where the money goes. So we make it on the front end by selling you something generic, and then we spend it on the back end, investing in me being able to do research, buildings and services and athletic centers and all the other sort of crazy things that universities do. And so we sell you a bundle. So if you think about that, it's a sort of a bundle of services, and we're doing a lot of cross-subsidization. Now, what happens if you break that bundle? Well, that could be problematic. And believe me, plenty of people are busy kind of banging on the door trying to figure out how to break the bundle. And so that's the path of entry, is to not only break this apart, but also potentially bring a lot of new supply to the market that doesn't cost nearly as much as your sort of traditional faculty member. And then, of course, their problem, which has yet to be solved, is this notion of, well, if I do one of these things that's electronic, would anybody believe it or care? This is an experiment in progress. In 5 years, let's come back and see sort of A, what the responses were, and B, how people sorted through solving that problem. Because of course, you should hardly expect the empire to stay still. They will strike back. We've seen it now on the Airbnb. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're violating housing rules. That's bad. We need to stop you from doing that because it's, well, yeah, exactly. The tax issue. Same thing with car renting, car sharing systems that has some of the same features. So some of it you could say, yes, that's all about public safety. And some of it you might say, well, perhaps that's what we euphemistically call regulatory capture. That's something, though, to be expected, either to use to your advantage or as a launch or an entrant into one of these markets, expect that resistance. It'll be there. Okay, so now I want to talk just a little bit about kind of why is all this platform stuff happening now? I mean, didn't we do this in the 90s? Yeah, I mentioned early on, we had the dot-com boom. I mean, haven't we had this show already? And yet, it seems as though everywhere I look, the business models are evolving and changing in really kind of fast ways. So we got some data. This will be the only number I'll have, at least I'll try. And what's interesting about this graph is this is the annual shipments. So annual shipments of network-connected devices exceeded 1 billion in 2012. Now, obviously, a lot of that's just replacement because you have a 5-month cycle I learned this morning on sort of handheld devices. But a lot of it is new flow and growing connectivity. And you know, the Western world has maybe an average of 60 or 70%. Africa's 15. You know, what's going to happen when we bring 2 billion people onto the network? And what is that going to look like? And that'll happen fairly soon. That's likely to change things. So that's sort of one thing, is we just have a whole lot more connectivity than we used to. And then what that leads to is a lot of new behavior. So if you're constantly connected, and I know half the people in the room have probably already interacted with the network, you know, in the last 10 minutes. So that's constant connectivity. And that enables us to do this joint production on these platforms that was never possible before. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're starting to see some sort of new and different things. And I would suggest that we've sort of only seen the beginning as we kind of think through and people try new things. And the others is just, look, it just doesn't cost that much anymore to launch new ventures and to get access to things like data centers and network connectivity, where, you know, it might have cost millions of dollars because you actually had to build server racks. It's really only the large entities that need to do that anymore. Now, I don't really believe that it costs $5,000 to launch something, because we tried that and it costs more than that. So I've been involved in a couple of startups, and you know, some of them have moved all the way into the millions, others have sort of been in the hundreds of thousands. But the point is, there's a lot of shared infrastructure that's now available that never was there before, and there's no reason that you wouldn't then expect a lot more people to be building new things. So now let's talk about sort of the platforms and the big kind of platform firms that everyone is pretty familiar with. So I like to think of them as the accidental platforms in some way. So let's take iTunes. It's sort of hard to believe that they had a map that said, we're going to be the nexus point of apps and media, and then sell devices on the other side at 60% margins and kind of print money. That really wasn't the problem they were trying to solve. The problem they were trying to solve at the beginning was just, how do I get a CD into my iPod, you know, on my iPod? And then it was, well, how do I deal with the kind of Napster issue? And so then I'll cut a deal with the media companies. And then all of a sudden, we're like, oh, this is pretty good. Now I'm sitting in the middle of a network, and I'm able to observe transactions across, and I'm able to do matching, and now I've got a relationship and a channel that I can start pushing all kinds of stuff through. That's, you know, so to their credit, they certainly recognized it and built it and extended it, but it's hard to argue that that was a platform by intent. And I think if you work through many of the other examples, you'd kind of come to the same conclusion, that Amazon solved a problem of sort of more efficient delivery, and then eventually backed into, oh, now we have this shared infrastructure, and we do all kinds of things with it. Similarly with Google, and then similarly with Facebook. Started with lots of kind of one-sided network connectivity, generated a lot of value, and they said, well, eventually people didn't give us $100 million that we blew through simply so that we could put every college student talking to each other. They do kind of expect us to make some money someday, and then they had to deliberately build out the other side of the network and give you Facebook markup language and Connect and the store and sort of all the ways that you might monetize the value that was getting created. But that, again, started out in a kind of a lucky way. And so the question you might ask is, well, are we going to now see platforms? The architect, Peter, I couldn't help it. I was thinking about you today. I almost switched the picture. Yeah, but as we start to figure out kind of design principles and run tests and observe enough launches to say, well, what works and what doesn't, are we going to get a sort of at least a minimum set of things that work that will allow us to develop platforms by intent? And that's sort of where we're at, as trying to say, well, what are those design rules? And Marshall and Sangeet will share with you sort of some of our current thinking a little bit later. But again, the purpose of a day like today for us is to road test ideas and to get feedback. I hope I've convinced you that there are a lot of targets. And I painted one on my own back. So I don't think the education industry is in any way immune. But honestly, the legal industry, if you think about if you have a gatekeeper that's standing in the way between supply and demand and enforcing high margins, that pretty much automatically makes you a target. The finance industry, so 3 to 4% of the economy sort of chewed up in moving money from pile A to pile B, that's a pretty high margin, and you might expect some entrance into that industry. And then, Peter Evans, where are you, from GE, and I have been engaging in a set of conversations over, well, what about physical networks? And sort of why haven't we seen platforms arise there in the same way? And so we'll be sort of asking the question, where is the information value add that would allow you to aggregate a lot of activity that might then start to change the structure of some of those industries? And again, patterns, gatekeepers protecting margins, bringing forth new supply, and systems that by the very activity end up generating value that would be difficult to replicate in a kind of a linear supply fashion. Okay, so what I was hoping to do is not completely depress you, so it's actually sunrise again, I believe. And just to take away this notion of design with intent, and that I'd like to collectively start to work out some of the rules, and we'll, again, as I said, we'll share some of those. This criticality of nurturing ecosystems and making sure that you understand where value is created in a network. And I've actually done this map. I have a couple of minutes, so I'll share the story. So I went and worked with a firm on their board pitch because they were entering a new market. And so we mapped this sort of value, and there was this one side of people who were a real hassle. And because they did a lot of quality enforcement in order to connect to the network, and that side didn't like it. And the firm I was working with, really, because they weren't getting any money from that side, they didn't treat them particularly well. And we had a set of interviews, and the interviews came back, and they said, oh, we hate you guys. And I mapped the value, and I said, look, nobody will be over here, the people who pay you money, if these guys aren't over there. And these guys hate you. You might want to rethink that sort of situation before you design this and bring it to your board. So that was a fun one. This notion of creating flow and then making sure that you're capturing the data and thinking of the data as the critical resource and that flow, and not necessarily any particular product feature. we can always sort of layer product features on. It's much more difficult to create the relationship and the flow with some set of users. And then finally, and this is where I'll end, is a lot of firms that I've spoken with over the last couple of years, especially traditional firms, have a really hard time kind of dealing with competitors that are organized as platforms when they're organized to serve vertical markets. And for sort of all the reasons you might expect. You've got a manager who's got a vertical and a P&L and a set of relationships and a set of resources, and then you have some other vertical, and they're not necessarily sharing common infrastructure, and they're not sharing data, and they're not interoperable. And I mean, I've made the point to some groups I've worked with, and I said, well, here's competitor A. You could replicate all of that functionality. You have it all. This is a major firm. How many logins would it take to do that? And they look at their shoes. It'd be about 10. I said, well, nobody's going to take 10 and do the integration so that they can buy from you to replace that. They're just going to go do that. And so I think that internal reorganization piece, especially for kind of established firms, is one of the areas that I'd emphasize as an ongoing project. And something I'd sort of love to engage people in thinking about. So that is sort of my intro on how we're thinking about platforms.
So I'll take a question.
I'll take a few questions. Yeah?
I'm Geoff Jarvis with CUNY. That was great, Geoff. I'm trying to make, just for definitional purposes, a list of the characteristics of platforms, right? So I heard you say that they grow value with growing use, they break bundles. I would add that when your users take over your platform and use it in ways you can't guess, that's when you know you have a platform. That you're a smart member of an ecosystem and you understand that operation. What else? What are the other characteristics of a platform? Or have I just led into Marshall?
So we're going to, you've led in, so lots. But I want to push back slightly on I like the idea that it's a platform when somebody does something with it that you didn't expect. But I might push back and go, well, does that mean it was an accidental platform? Because it wasn't designed with the expectation that people would do new things.
That's when people know when your users truly find use in you. My joke is that if Microsoft designed Craigslist, they would have come up with a big bundle, a user agreement, and a talking paperclip telling you how you may use it.
No, and we've been batting this around because I've used that quote from Peter, was it from you, Geoff, that I heard here in May. I love it, and then I wanted to peel it back and go, well, yes, but I would also like to think about the design intent and sort of what can I do so that they do weird and wonderful things, but I've thought about enabling that. So that it didn't have to be a hack.
Geoff, whatever you're remembering me saying was probably something along the lines of everyone who's come to market and then proclaimed themselves a platform has been greeted by a resounding, oh yeah, we'll tell you.
Yeah. And it's a great line. Yeah, agreed.
And there are people who come to market and say, we're going to be a platform.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe. Developers will decide if they find you the way to do stuff, and then you become a platform. Now, I know that's accidental.
Well, or worse.
You do things that enable that to happen.
Yeah.
But proclaiming yourself a platform is an act of hubris. Yeah.
I heard you say that the platform is more of an economic engine. So if you think about Airbnb as a platform, people aren't doing anything novel that they hadn't intended. I think you're coming at it more from that.
Well, and the nice thing about the Airbnb is that that's moving us from examples that are information into the physical world, but using information to solve problems and add value.
And
so.
Jeremiah Ouyang at Altimeter Group has been saying, he looked at Airbnb and he said, what does Marriott do in a world where Airbnb can come into existence? And you talked about trust, and there are things Marriott can do to become more of a platform.
Yes.
Because if they fail to do that, then Airbnb will be taking business away from them. That right now their brand franchise makes it their game to lose, but they're losing.
Same as car rental.
Exactly. Which is why, interestingly, Enterprise just bought one of the units of Lyft. to do
Cool.
carpool management.
Yeah.
They've understood that they have two choices, and one of them is to become irrelevant.
Absolutely. I do want to add one idea to Jeff's question. I think it's actually a really important issue. So one of them is an open standard that allows your stuff to be incorporated so others can build on it. But another element I think is really important that's usually missed is you need the rules of play. You need the governance.
Absolutely.
Why are your users going to participate in your system? It goes to the thing that Jeff was talking about earlier. If this other group hates you, then they're not going to participate. You got to put the rules out there with a whiffum. What's in it for me if I'm contributing to you? So the rules of play, the governance, is another critical element to getting this right.
And that's one of our sort of core design principles, is literally on the governance side. Peter.
I'd love if you can elaborate on the co-creation, because I can think of a bunch of different examples, but I'm interested in what you're thinking of, and is it a necessary condition, or is it something that some platforms are good at, but not necessarily all? Is it one of your design principles?
So great question, and I'm not going to pretend I have a complete answer, but so I think that the co-creation is one of the things that can work. I'm not convinced that it has to be. So for example, in the Airbnb, I don't see that as a situation where there's a lot of co-creation. I see that as the information component gave access to supply. So if I was going to think about the more sort of physical systems, sidebar, I spent a lot of time working at GE, so we're having a lot of fun catching up on GE things. That's where I would see information adding value to the existing physical networks. But not necessarily that kind of flow that you think about in social networks. So, we should expect to see lions and tigers and bears, and they'll behave differently, but I'm hoping that we can lay out enough principles to say, okay, I'm in this category or that, and then I sort it through.
You had a list of verticals over there that were targets. Nobody missing.
Oh, it was not meant to be anything more than a couple of examples.
Okay, the one that was missing was healthcare.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if a platform delivers consumer value and,
healthcare is absolutely, and Vince, I think is in the room, can talk in more depth to that than I can, but we completely agree with you. Yep. All right.